Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's medical grand rounds. So shut up, sit down, no talking in the back. Get your phones off or there'll be trouble. We're going to talk about psychological safety in the clinical and academic workplace. Is it too much to expect? You might think so. Before we start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we're located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakutasu, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Soti, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, cultures continue to enrich our vibrant community. Now today, and you might not recognize him from his photograph, we have Dr. Robert Pauly. He received his medical degree at the University of British Columbia before training in internal medicine at the University of Alberta. He received his clinical training in nephrology at McGill University and subsequently completed a master's degree in epidemiology at the same institution and a research fellowship in home hemodialysis at the University of Toronto. However, recovering, he's back here. He's currently a professor of medicine, as well as the assistant dean in the Office of Faculty Wellbeing at the University of Alberta. His research interests include the delivery of home hemodialysis and the interaction between the electronic health record and clinician wellbeing. So thank you very much for speaking to us, Dr. Pauly. I'm sure you'll do better at me in encouraging a psychological safe workplace. Thank you.
Okay, that was great. I don't even know how to top that. Is that okay? Yeah, I can hear myself, so hopefully everybody else can too. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation at Medicine Grand Rounds. Psychological safety in the clinical and academic workplace. Is it too much to expect? I want to take us back to March of 1977 to the island of Tenerife. This is a little island off the coast of Morocco. There are two 747 airliners that are standing at opposite ends of a runway. They can't see one another. The runways are completely fogged in with a very thick fog that had come in. And there were some other circumstances around why these two airplanes were on the runway at that time. Now, the pilot in the KLM flight was one of the most senior pilots in the entire KLM fleet. And because of a number of circumstances that had transpired in the hours prior to this state, he was really keen to get the flight going. There were two other people in the cockpit of the 747 that morning. They were two more junior officers, an engineer and a first officer. And flight data recordings indicate that those two officers had tried very hard to convince the pilot that maybe it was, premature to start the acceleration. But the pilot wouldn't hear any of it. They were late, they wanted to get off the ground, they needed to get back to Amsterdam, and off they went to accelerate. And just moments later, the biggest civil aviation disaster in history transpired, and 588 people lost their lives. Perhaps if the two individuals, the two junior people in the cockpit had felt more empowered that morning, those people would still be alive. A junior nurse in a neonatal intensive care unit. He's hanging a new medication that he's not entirely familiar with, used at a different dose than what would be typical. He's thinking, maybe I should ask the neonatologist what to do and just to confirm that everything is okay. But then he remembers that last week, the neonatologist, she berated one of his colleagues. And there was some public shaming involved about why her orders were being questioned. And so he figures, well, you know what? The doctor knows best. Let's just keep our fingers crossed. But he's concerned about the preemie. Something doesn't quite feel right. 2015. Volkswagen is the leading automaker in the world. Well, we'll all remember 2015 and Volkswagen, that's synonymous with Dieselgate, where a huge scandal developed because Volkswagen fraudulently claimed that their vehicles were able to pass emission standards, which in fact they were not. And root cause analysis basically brings us back to a corporate suite back in Germany, especially the CEO, where there were exacting standards of an authoritarian leadership styles, where dissent was not tolerated, and a workforce all the way throughout the organization that was too afraid to actually speak up and raise concerns. Psychological safety. Not only is this an issue for the corporate world and in the airline industry, but it's something that affects all of us as well. And I want to give some disclaimers at this point. I would like to remind us that the concepts that I will be speaking about today are really rather universal. And because of that universality, you may recognize some elements of that within our own working environments. You may recognize yourself, that's unintentional on my part. The scenarios that I'm presenting are unfortunately altogether far too common. A talk like this may make us feel a bit uncomfortable, and I want to lean into that discomfort. I think a certain degree of discomfort is healthy. Hopefully this talk doesn't make anyone feel too complacent. And with that, I want to introduce the objectives for today's talk. I want us to have a working definition of psychological safety by the time we're done. I want us to have a better understanding of why psychological safety is important in our workplace, and to consider the psychological safety of our working environment here at in the Department of Medicine. And so in the last few years, since being in my role with a certain interest in faculty wellness, I like to begin most of my talks by reminding us about the Stanford model of professional fulfillment. And so at the center of this model is our professional fulfillment, our wellness. And at the bottom, we see that there is personal resilience. That's me. That's what I bring to the table as an individual. This is eating, sleeping, my spirituality, yoga, meditation, et cetera, et cetera. And this model is really nice because it reminds us that professional fulfillment isn't all about me. In fact, it's mostly about the environment that we're in. And the other really important element is the efficiency of our practice. That's the operations. And so for those of you who heard me speak last year when we talked about the electronic health record, that was squarely situated in that domain. And today's talk is really about this other domain that I haven't yet covered in this venue, and that is the culture of wellness. Remember that culture is a set of normative values that we implicitly agree to abide by. It's what we talk about when we think about our sense of community, for better or for worse. And so we're squarely located here in culture today when we think about psychological safety. And many talks on psychological safety will often start with Project Aristotle. It starts with Google, where most of us begin most of our searches for everything else. And Google, around 2010, became very interested in the idea of what makes the best teams. And of course, Google's got lots of data, and they studied hundreds of Google teams to determine why are some so successful and other teams so lackluster. And they asked themselves, well, a perfect team, is it about combining the best individuals at something? Is it about introverts and extroverts and cohorting those in a special way? Is it about whether people have friendships outside of work, whether they have similar interests, motivated by similar rewards, financial rewards, a pat on the back, public acknowledgement, whatever? Is it bringing together people of similar backgrounds? Or in the management literature, there was this big thing about like getting the right gender mix around people, or lots and lots of other things. But what's really nicely summarized here is by this chap who was part of the Google People Analytics division, who sort of summed it up by saying, at Google, we're good at finding patterns. There just weren't any strong patterns here, perhaps a bit surprisingly. And so this is when Google stumbled a little bit upon this idea of group norms. And they recognized that, look, some teams get together, there's a bit of social banter, things kind of go smoothly, and then they get into work. Others are immediately task-oriented, there's no, sort of funny business going on. Other groups are conflict averse, others really, dig into that. And so they kind of started to think about this idea. What is it about group norms, and could group norms be important? So let's just think about that concept for a moment. Group norms are traditions, standards of behavior, and rules, often informal, that govern how we engage when we gather into groups. They can be explicit, but more often than not in our environments, they're implicit. Group norms typically override our individual tendencies, which is why when people come and go out of our groups, our group norms kind of stay the same. It's very hard to change those group norms. It's what we call team culture. Now, in and around this time, when Google was kind of working on this topic, there were an interesting group from Carnegie Mellon and from MIT School of Business who were working on this sort of from a business psychology angle. And I want to sort of take a little detour here with this study because I find this really interesting. This study is entitled Evidence for a Collective Intelligence Factor in the Performance of Human Groups. And this was published in, a journal of no less esteem than the journal Science in 2010. And so let's expand this for a minute. Let's think about individual intelligence. So it's something that might be measured like by an IQ test, something like that. And psychologists have known for a long time that the cognitive ability of individuals sort of represents about 30 to 50% of the variance in people's individual outcomes and is very predictive of a whole wide range of kind of life outcomes and circumstances. And so these business/psychology types thought, we wonder if there is an analogous group intelligence factor that might be similar, that might sort of explain group performance. And so they did some really clever work where they got groups of varying sizes together to do a number of really interesting activities. So from visual puzzles, brainstorming, making collective moral decisions, and negotiating over limited resources. And so people in groups had to tackle these complex processes. And in fact, what they discovered was that there is, in fact, this collective group intelligence factor. And that this collective group intelligence factor was more predictive, and in fact, the most predictive outcome of a group's effectiveness than even individual characteristics of the group members themselves. And so, of course, they did what is sort of the most natural thing to do is, if this group intelligence factor exists, which they claim it does, are there any individual characteristics or group characteristics that predict that intelligence factor, that group intelligence factor? And in fact, they show that there is a correlation with average social sensitivity of group members and a negative correlation with the variance in the number of speaking terms by group members. Holy cow, what does that mean? Well, to put it bluntly, groups that had more empathy and sensitivity towards one another within the group, so if group members could sense and gauge how other people in the group were responding and feeling, they had a higher collective group intelligence. And groups where individuals all had a roughly equal speaking turn in their meetings and in their deliberations, they also had a higher collective group intelligence. And so it turns out that groups have unique performance dynamics that are different than individual performance metrics. And that these norms, the norms of empathy and conversational turn taking, seem to be really critical in defining whether groups are effective or not. So back to Google. Google would have become aware of this because this work was being done at roughly the same time. And so Google then went ahead and looked at 180 high and low performing teams from around their global empire and figured, let's figure this out. Now, what did Google figure out didn't matter? So co-location of team members didn't matter, which is kind of interesting as we've all come through COVID now and we're all not so co-located anymore. Consensus-driven decision-making didn't matter, which I think is really interesting because we tend to think, we're kind of like, oh, we're all going to create consensus. But remember, Google isn't a democracy. Google's a corporation. They're not into consensus. They're getting the job done. So it's not about consensus decision-making. It's not about the extroversion of team members, and it's not about the individual performance of individual team members, much like the Carnegie Mellon MIT study that I just talked about. It's not about workload size, seniority, or even team size. What did matter Now, I want to point out, it's not that all of those things didn't matter for lots of other stuff about getting the job done, just not about effectiveness in the way in which Google defined it. But what did matter? So team members had to feel that their work was going to have some important impact. There had to be meaning. That's why meaning comes up. That work is personally important to team members, that there is structure and clarity around the team's roles and responsibilities, that there is dependability on one another to get the job done. But the number one factor that determined the effectiveness of the team was this concept of psychological safety. That is, that team members feel safe to take risks and to be vulnerable in front of one another. And so obviously we're going to spend the rest of this talk talking about psychological safety. So what is it? So Amy Edmondson, she's sort of the godmother of this entire body of work of psychological safety, defined this in the late 1990s as a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So safe for interpersonal risk-taking. We're going to come back a lot to this idea of interpersonal risk-taking in the coming slides. But I want to further develop the idea of psychological safety for us. Psychological safety refers to a climate. It's this pervasive climate that we live in. It doesn't mean that we can't all have oops moments in our interactions with people, but it's the pervasiveness of how we engage and interact with one another that's important. It is intentional. I suppose perhaps it can come about sort of by pure happenstance and accident, but usually there's some thought behind it. It is a feature of our workplace. And that feature is that behaviors are not stifled by interpersonal fear within our groups, that people are comfortable expressing and being themselves in their true selves, that people are comfortable sharing their concerns and importantly, comfortable about sharing their mistakes. And that people can speak up without fear of being humiliated, ignored, blamed, bullied, embarrassed, rejected, pressured, or punished. That's an environment that I think all of us want to live in. And importantly, psychological safety is shaped by local leaders in a hierarchy. Let's think about that for a minute. On a day-to-day basis, do I really care who the CEO of AHS is? On a day-to-day basis, do I really care who the Dean of Medicine is? And as nice as Narman is, on most days, do I really care how nice Narman is? Probably not. What I really care about are the people with whom I interact and the leadership structure that is immediately above me. The people who help me when I need help, who get in the way when I need them not to, the people who make up our call schedules, who assign our duties, right? I mean, that's kind of natural. And that's important because we come back to that a lot. Now, how did Amy Edmondson come up with all of this stuff? Well, to some extent, it was a bit of an accidental discovery. As part of her PhD, she was supposed to go out and measure how teams in hospitals interact with one another. And so she spent 6 months collecting data on medical errors and on the interpersonal relationships of team members on wards. And she hypothesized, sort of naturally, that the most effective teams make the fewest errors. Sort of seems like a no-brainer, low-hanging fruit. But in fact, she found quite the opposite, that better teams make more mistakes. And so what did she do? She sort of thought, wait a minute, maybe I got it wrong. Maybe it's that effective teams don't make more mistakes, they just report more. And so what she did was she hired a research associate, sent the research associate back to the same set of wards without telling the research associate what the new hypothesis was, or like even really anything about kind of what they were trying to show. She sent the guy in to say, okay, you go study these teams and you come back and you tell me which of these teams have this open culture of discussing stuff, especially problems and errors. And then we'll see how things correlate. And I want to show that to you. Now, I'm not going to show you a lot of data during this talk, but this is one piece just because I find this so cool. Now, what you can see across the top is you see like Memorial 1 and University 1. So these are two different hospitals, Memorial and University, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're different wards within these hospital settings. And then the next row, this one here, this is the error detection row. Now, just for those of you who are online, let's see if you can, that's this, the error detection row. And you can see here that it starts off with the highest error rate at Memorial 1 and then progressively gets lower with a lower error rate in Memorial 3. And then this is what the research associate found. This is the interviewer's overall rating to openness, the openness to discuss. And lo and behold, you can see that there is this gradation here from a high openness to discuss down through various gradations to a very low openness to discuss. And that correlates amazingly well with the error rates. That is high openness to discuss, high reported error rates, low openness to discuss, low error rates. And so perhaps this openness to report concept, which seems to be pretty important for psychological safety, can come up in the following way. Good teams are open to reporting, therefore they do report, and there's a higher error rate that's discovered. This, of course, varies across groups within hospitals. And so as you saw on the previous slide, even within the same hospital, different wards had different levels of openness and different levels of reporting, which would tend to suggest that there's a reason why, for example, psychological safety might be quite different in an endoscopy suite than it might be, on a ward, even though it may be the same types of people who are interacting in both places. Now, of course, this work by Amy Edmondson was first done in this particular setting, but you could quickly imagine how the concept of openness to talk and psychological safety can translate into lots of different environments as well. And so this openness to talk is clearly a central tenet of psychological safety. And people who don't want any of these things, well, they've got some mechanisms that protects them. So if you don't want to look ignorant, you're not going to ask questions. If you don't want to look incompetent, you don't admit mistakes. If you don't want to look intrusive, you don't make any suggestions. If you don't want to be labeled as being negative, you don't criticize the status quo. And if you don't want to offend someone, you just don't say anything at all. In order to speak up, you have to be safe. And so it turns out that all of us are unconscious calculators. And this gets back to the interpersonal risk concept. And so what we tend to do is we overweigh the perceived personal immediate risk of a negative outcome. That is like all the things that I just talked about, appearing ignorant and intrusive, incompetent, perhaps even risking public shaming or retribution or retaliation down the line. And we do what psychologists call discounting the future. And in discounting the future, we underweigh the more important, but not immediately obvious future risk of not speaking up in the present. And of course, a person's perception of risk is highly dependent on where you reside in the hierarchy of the organizational structure, right? This is probably why you've got lots of junior people sometimes, keeping their heads down and just getting the work done and waiting until they've got enough seniority to finally speak up and say something. Let's develop that concept a little bit further. And I want to do that by looking at the voice silence paradigm. And I want us to think about who benefits, when that benefit occurs, and the certainty of that benefit when we have inherent voice versus when there is silence. Now, silence is, when we feel like we can't speak up. So let's talk about voice first. Who benefits? Well, the team does, right? If I bring up ideas during team meetings, we can all benefit from that, right? That I contribute to the richness of the ideas in the room. When that benefit occurs is after some delay, because, usually we don't make decisions right away. And the certainty of that benefit is low. Let's just think about that for a minute. If we are all contributing to the pool of ideas that are in the room, the likelihood that my brilliant genius idea carries the day in light of everybody else's brilliant and genius ideas is pretty low. So the risk of me saying stuff, or the certainty of benefit, I should say, is low. But let's think about silence for a minute. Who benefits there? I do. I'm the one who doesn't get labeled as being ignorant or a fool or whatever, all those negative things that we just talked about. And the certainty of that benefit, or rather, when that benefit occurs, is immediate. I don't look like an idiot like right now. And the certainty of that benefit is high. If I don't say anything, the benefit of me not having negative outcomes is very, very high. So there is a powerful instinct to play things safe, especially when the benefit of self-protection is immediate and it's certain. And so let's think a little bit more about the idea of silence, because that's really something that stifles psychological safety. And this is from a systematic review that was entitled, "When is Silence Golden? A Meta-analysis on the Antecedents and Outcomes of Employee Silence." And they define or describe this conceptual framework, listing three antecedents: the individual dispositions, the job perceptions and beliefs of employees, and then the leader-related factors. Now, this is based on this meta-analysis of incorporating over 60,000 participants in these various studies. So this is going to be as robust as we're going to get. And I list job perceptions and beliefs of us as individuals, but I particularly highlight leader-related factors because leaders immediately have an impact on employee silence, but they also do so indirectly through job perceptions. I want to describe that for a minute. Remember, we work in organizations where we have purported values, and we, parade those values out a few times a year in annual reports. And then, of course, we have what happens on a day-to-day basis. And when there is a discordance in our day-to-day to the purported values that we espouse having, that impacts job perceptions and beliefs. And so leaders whose job it is to have alignment between values in our day-to-day hold a very important responsibility in fostering and nurturing employee voice or silence. Now, what are the outcomes? It's not going to be rocket science that employee silence is associated with burnout, stress, turnover intention, job withdrawal, and deviant behavior, and is negatively correlated with the things that we all would like to see: organizational commitment, job satisfaction, work engagement, task performance, and innovative work behavior. So why is all this silence tolerated? Well, we've already discovered that silence on an individual basis is tolerated because we're all individual risk calculators. But what about on a group level, on an organizational scale? And that leads us to the question of the elephant. And this is from a paper called "Elephants in Academic Medicine." An elephant in a room would be impossible to miss. Thus, the people in the room who are jointly and cooperatively pretending it is not there have made a collective decision to ignore it. And so the question of the elephant leads us to the elephant question. What are important problems within departments, the medical schools, or the teaching hospitals that need to be confronted, but for various reasons are ignored, often for long periods of time? This question was asked of, let me just get this right, 256 chairs of medicine and surgery accredited by the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, the LCME, in the United States, with a response rate of 139 chairs. So what I'm going to show you is the results of 139 chairs of medicine and surgery. So these are people like our leaders. Now, the question was further broken down into these three. What are the major elephants in your academic health center? What do you believe to be the most prevalent reasons people do not speak up? And what are the consequences of remaining silent? And so I'm going to basically get you to focus on this column here at the end and the first column, because whether you were a surgery chair or a medicine chair, it turns out the rankings are exactly the same, and I want to walk you through those. So the number one elephant that chairs define was a misalignment between goals and available resources. The second one is ignoring information that clearly indicates a performance problem, an unwillingness to give up on a failing strategy, an unwillingness to speak up about inequities, that is pay, space, favoritism, special deals, and a failure to deal with disruptive behaviors. Are these perhaps ringing some bells from our own environment, right? In the physical room, I'm seeing some head nodding. I'm imagining people are apoplectic in the virtual world. Now, reasons for organizational silence. Chairs thought that the reasons for organizational silence were a belief that speaking up will be ignored, a reluctance to deal with an issue once it's exposed, and a personal fear of repercussions. This should be a bit surprising because it was to me. These are chairs, right? Like you would think these are the people who shouldn't have any of these things. The consequences of organizational silence. This is what chairs thought were the consequences. Organizations don't learn from their mistakes. There's a negative impact on faculty and staff morale. There is poor decision-making from inadequate information sharing. Not speaking up becomes a cultural norm, and problems with faculty and staff retention. In fact, only 23% of chairs reported that leaders actually encourage people to call out and deal with elephants. 55% of chairs said that their leaders said they wanted to have those issues dealt with, but that their actions and their nonverbal cues communicated quite the opposite. And 80% of chairs said that the best way to deal with elephants was for top leaders to set the example by acknowledging and confronting those elephants. And so again, I come back to the idea that we all sit within a certain place within the hierarchy of our organization. And even chairs of medicine and surgery themselves feel like they need the support of their leadership in order to confront and deal with elephants. But we all know where this usually lands. It usually lands right here, where people quickly realize which elephants are not up for discussion, and they know if they speak up, retribution may be lurking around the corner. But I want to use this as an opportunity to remind us what psychological safety is not. It's not random. I think we discussed that. It's also not an immunity from consequences. It's not that we all sit around, hold hands, sing kumbaya, and make consensus decisions where ultimately nothing really happens. It's not about being nice. It's about being respectful and having a discourse that acknowledges people's diversity of opinions and ideas, and then navigates a way through conflict that is meaningful and respectful and leaves people with their dignity intact. It's not a personality factor. It's a climate, right? So introverts and extroverts and everyone else in between is going to experience that climate the same way as everybody else does. It's not about group cohesiveness. And in fact, this is a bit perhaps ironic, but let's think about that. A really cohesive group might actually stifle dealing with confrontation for the sake of maintaining that cohesiveness. And yet confrontation is an important part of our working lives. So navigating that in an important and in a respectful way is about psychological safety. It's not about cohesiveness. It's not synonymous with trust. Trust is different. Trust is what I have in someone else about something that might happen in the future. I trust that you've got my back in the future about something. Psychological safety is about you giving me the benefit of the doubt about my weakness, my frailty, my insecurities in the moment. So they are distinct concepts. And it's not about lowering performance standards. Now, I want to sort of develop that idea a little bit further as well. So if we think here in this 2x2 table, we've got psychological safety on the one side, we've got standards on the other side. So when we have low psychological safety and low standards, this is what Amy Edmondson would define as the apathy zone. When we have low psychological safety and high standards, we're in what she calls the anxiety zone. Think Volkswagen, but also think about many of our work environments where we have all these pressures and we have confusion between, a certain management style and getting the job done. When we have high psychological safety and low standards, we're in a cushy squishy zone. And when we have high psychological safety and high standards, we're in a high performing learning zone. This is where stuff gets done, where problems get dealt with, where issues are resolved, where we move forward in a respectful and constructive way. Now, I'm not the only guy to have thought of any of these things clearly. We all remember in 2008, the Institutes for Health Improvement defined the triple aim, right? And this has been sort of, talked about a lot of times. Triple aim, improving the health of the population, improving the experience of the people receiving that health, and doing all of that magically at a lower cost per patient. Makes a lot of sense. Except you can't do these things at the cost of a workforce that you're burning out. And so very quickly, this triple aim was supplanted by the quadruple aim, where this element here, the care team well-being, was added into the equation, because you can't achieve the first three pillars at the expense of the fourth. And in fact, even the health institution that we work at Alberta Health Services, has very clearly defined this and outlined this and adopted the quadruple aim. And in fact, right here, they quite clearly say that their goal 3 in this quadruple aim is to improve the experience and safety of our people. And the other major institution, did I just lose? It died. Anyway, I should probably be okay. The other major institution that we work for, that's the FOMD, has recently come up with our new strategic plan, Vision 2025. And at one of the centerpieces of that is this pillar of people in the middle there. And as part of that people strategic plan, there is this idea of establishing structures for growing leadership skills around building psychological safety, dealing with mistreatment, anti-racism, and well-being. So clearly, this is going to be a part of our environment, and it's an important part of our environment that needs to be explored. Now, when we think about psychological safety and think about measuring it, it's helpful to ground ourselves in some examples. And so over the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through some examples of what is not psychological safety, so that we're all having some real concrete things to sort of wrap our heads around. Belittling a colleague in a public venue, such as case rounds, about a difference in clinical judgment or decision-making. That's not psychological safety. Engaging in romantic overtures with a learner. That's not psychological safety, even when there is perceived consent. Being called out on a microaggression or bullying of a visible minority staff person, and then doubling down. That's not psychological safety. Pressuring a colleague to disclose privileged information by telling her she will be in trouble if she doesn't. Exerting undue pressure on a junior colleague to take one's undesirable call. Manipulating a call schedule to be favorable to some, but obviously not to others. Conflating international medical graduate status with expected gratitude for employment. This, unbelievably enough, is extremely common. Withholding or threatening to withhold reference letters, recommendations, evaluations, or authorship as a means to pressure a learner. Offloading committee work to junior colleagues, but taking credit for their contributions. Blaming a nurse for a poor clinical outcome when the issue was never nursing related. Inappropriate delegation of work to others without checking for alignment, capacity, or engagement. At best, these are examples of someone being extremely tone deaf. And at worst, they're a violation of every code of ethic, code of conduct, and will put you into trouble with CPSA or CARNA or whoever our regulatory bodies are. It turns out that a health organization that supports and tolerates disrespectful behavior is hostile to its workers. And although disrespectful behavior permeates all of healthcare, physicians dominate the culture and set the tone. And so we have a very unique responsibility within the healthcare system to address this issue. And so why do we tolerate the elephants? Because those 12 scenarios that I just went through, they're oftentimes the worst kept secrets in the groups that we all work in. So why do we tolerate those things? Well, we live in a world where there is an inherent power differential between us and, sort of us as the rank and file, and those people to whom we look to help us manage those things. And what's the nature of that power differential? Well, we're dependent on evaluations, reference letters, merit increments, recommendations, graduation, promotion, advocacy, employment, and the list goes on and on. There's risk of network disruption. I mean, we live in very, very small silos. And even if you think of Alberta, we live in a small silo. And even if we think of the Canadian academic environment that we work in, I mean, I know just about every nephrologist across the country in an academic setting. My reputation precedes me and theirs precedes them. These things can backfire big time. And then there's the question of, why does senior leadership sometimes appear to be so unhelpful? And I want to dig into that a little bit, because this is an area of perceived disappointment sometimes amongst the rank and file. And I want to give some color to that conversation. So it may be that there is an actual conflict of interest between, sort of the people who we're concerned about and senior leadership. And so I think we have to acknowledge that conflict of interest can be real. There is oftentimes an ignorance of senior leadership about just how serious a problem is in, a group that they're responsible for. The impact of what goes on in one group on the morale within that group. There can be due process. Sometimes, perhaps more often than we're aware, our senior leadership actually isn't ignorant. They're fully aware of what's going on, and they're going through a process of due process to work through the performance management of issues that need to be worked through within groups. But because that process, for very good reasons, is somewhat opaque, those of us in the rank and file, we're just not aware that things are happening in the background. And truth be told, this is probably more common, and we ought to give our senior leaders perhaps a little more credit than perhaps what is the most immediate knee-jerk reaction. It could also be that there's competing agendas, right? Senior leaders are aware of other things that the rest of us aren't aware of. And sometimes navigating through a situation will leave a hole somewhere else that might be a bigger problem. Senior leaders may not be familiar with the administrative levers and mechanisms that need to be pulled and maneuvered to navigate a system. There can be fear of legal entanglement. And in the end, it's just hard. So it's just easier to punt these things until my term is over, their term is over, somebody retires, or whatever. Because sometimes these things just sort themselves out, or at least that's the perception or the hope. But I'm reminded of this aphorism from the health improvement world that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And perhaps we can say the same thing about psychological safety within a work environment. It does work, that environment, for some people within that space. It just doesn't work for everyone. And the pesky thing about psychological safety is we're all kind of entitled to it. And so it doesn't matter if it just works for a few people, it sort of has to work for everyone. And this is where the idea of measurement comes up. Like I said, psychologically spaced environment may be safe for one person. It may not feel that way for everyone else. And so this is a pretty good place to think about the various lenses of privilege that we have. Now, I know it's a bit of a topical thing, and you may want to start throwing tomatoes. Fortunately, I don't think there's any in the physical room here. But let's ignore, for the sake of argument, the top sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 lenses of privilege, the ones that society talks about a lot: age, sex, gender, and race. And instead, think about the lenses of privilege that are really a little more unique to our environment. That is seniority, rank, and relationship to the leader. Can we imagine how someone who doesn't have these privileges, and maybe some overlapping areas of disparity in some of the other lenses of privilege, how they may perceive their psychological safety as quite different than the way I might perceive my degree of psychological safety? And with that in mind, I think it's helpful to think about measuring the psychological safety within our groups as an opportunity to highlight blind spots that we have and to address those things, not in a punitive way, but in a growth way. And so with that, I want to go over the results of the climate survey that I sent out over the last few weeks. And thank you, Andrea, for helping out so much. I want to be reminded at this point that I'm going to leave the climate survey open into next week. And I would encourage people to respond to that climate survey. It should also find itself magically in your chat right about now-ish. And so hopefully you'll be able to link into that and address that. And so we had, from the Department of Medicine, 145 respondents to our survey, which I think is pretty incredible. And I think people were really very engaged with this survey. You can see that almost 3/4 of individuals were staff physicians or staff researchers within our department. And the next biggest group were administrative staff. So our academic administrative staff. And then there were a smattering of responses from core internal medicine residents, from subspecialty fellows, and from graduate students. You can see that the Division of General Internal Medicine was very well represented, with almost 20% of respondents just from GIM. But interestingly, and I want to draw this to your attention, the next most prevalent group was the group that preferred not to say. And I think that's an important outcome that we all need to be very mindful of. And then, the other groups were also quite well represented in general. So for the question, can you speak up about clinical, administrative, and/or learning issues that are a concern? About 70% of people said, yep, I can. But 15% of people said no, and 13% were unsure. And so if you're unsure about that question, I'm going to say you're a no. Because why would you be unsure if you were a yes? Just let that sink in for a minute. Now, even though 70% of people said that they were okay bringing up concerns, when asked, do you fear reprisal if you do speak up, almost 40% said yes. Are you aware of bullying and/or intimidation of others on your team? There's a lot of people who said yes for that. So if you combine the yes and the unsure, you've got almost 50%. Is there backbiting? That is, talking about a third party when you're not present in your working and learning environment. This is an extremely prevalent problem, as you can see. Are you engaged to your maximal potential at work? So this is interesting, and this is a my bad, because I think this question was interpreted in multiple ways, and I'm going to come back to that at the end. Are your efforts or actions at work being undermined by someone else? 1 in 5 thought that was the case. If you could do so easily, would you seek reassignment to another team, leave entirely, or retire because of your current workplace environment. Almost 1 in 4 said that was the case for them. Do you feel you are being supported to meet your clinical, academic, or career goals? You can see there's a fairly large proportion of the population that responded no to that question. And please pick the single issue that is most detrimental to your current level of function. So you can see that about a quarter, that's this category right here, said my current level of function is good, I have no concerns. That's awesome. But that's only 1 in 4 people. You can see that about 1/3 said that managing administrative demands, meetings, evaluations, emails, probably the electronic health record falls into that category, that was their single biggest factor. And then you can see here that elements around psychological safety was about 1 in 5, and elements around clinical care was again also about 1 in 5. Now, the 145 people who responded to this survey gave us 277 written responses. So you can see that people were pretty engaged and really wanted to say stuff. Now, I can't share with you 277 responses, but I've thematically collated some of those things. The loss of administrative support. Now, this isn't an issue of psychological safety as much as it is, like, that's the environment that we live in. And this came through loud and clear in this survey. Maximum capacity. This gets back at the question that perhaps could have been phrased better. People indicated that they were definitely working to their maximum capacity, but they were not working to their maximum potential. There's a lot of paperwork or electronic equivalent paperwork that allowed people, or that took people away from the fulfillment of their jobs. Again, another message that came through fairly clearly was this conflictual relationship with learners, where learners are perceived to have a very high level of power and are believed without question, whereas faculty are naturally assumed to be guilty. And this was a pervasive message that came through the survey. Now, the last few items relate more to psychological safety. A very clear message that I received was that there is pervasive favoritism that is perceived in our faculty. The environment, or that is a negative environment, seems to be driven by just a few people that then muddies the water for everyone else. Microaggressions appear to be extremely common. This gets back to the talk that Janice Miyazaki gave the other week. Overt bullying seems to be less of an issue. There were several people who named victim blaming as a pervasive issue, and low morale as being a concern. Now, I have not picked up isolated things. I mean, I really looked at the information that people gave us and only put on this list stuff that lots of other people also commented on. So I think that's something that we need to really give some consideration to. And one of the most sobering quotes I've left with you here, even filling out this form anonymously, I am afraid of reprisal. That's one of our colleagues. So I don't want to end on an entirely too negative note. I'm not going to give you a huge menu of options as to what to do. That would cover the next 3 or 4 hours. So I'm going to give you a brief smattering. But I want to give you a thematic, and that is someone has to be willing to go first. And this responsibility for deliberately creating psychological safety falls squarely on the shoulders of leaders. It is up to the leader to set the tone, to go first, to model behaviors that promote safety and greater engagement. Moreover, the leaders need to do this repeatedly and frequently. So how are leaders supposed to do this? So here is a leader's roadmap, or what I think is my leader's roadmap for cultivating psychological safety. In 30 seconds, I'm going to go through this slide. This is the nature of like days and days worth of workshops. Psychological safety needs to be acknowledged, and in order to acknowledge it, you need to know what it is. In order to know what it is, you need to measure it. So akin to the climate survey that we've done for the department, this is what you need to know as a leader to understand about where your group is at. You need to solicit feedback. That feedback needs to be specific around elements that pertain to psychological safety and the support of your staff. And if you're interested, contact me. Our group within the FOMD has got some very specific ideas about how to make this happen, and we're happy to facilitate that. Leadership mentorship is important. We can't just go this alone. None of us were trained as leaders, least of all me. So I'm not going to pretend that I've got all the answers. I sure don't. And so this is helpful where we tap on leaders who have been there and done that, who have navigated some of the difficult waters that we have to navigate as leaders to help us figure out how to get around some of those things. We have some coaching. The FOMD actually has some coaching for leaders, and we need to be taking advantage of that. Leadership peer support, where we get together into groups as leaders to perhaps commiserate, discuss, be proactive, perhaps have that be facilitated. Leadership development around leadership behaviors. I think that's absolutely crucial. And that brings me to sort of my last substantive slide. And that is, I've listed for you here what I think are 3 of the most useful resources that I've come across in the last year or so. The first is a book called The Fearless Organization, written by Amy Edmondson, and that talks about psychological safety and how that's nurtured in organizations. It's very relevant to our FOMD. The second one is called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. This has got some incredibly concrete things that people can do to kind of immediately start on a path of psychological safety. And the third book here is called Connect, Building Exceptional Relationships with Family, Friends, and Colleagues. This comes from the Stanford School of Business. How do we actually operationalize some of those things? Well, in the autumn, there will be some of us who will be running a book club, and you will receive an invitation email, and I'd be more than happy to have you read these books with me again, and to maybe have some discussions around those things, to maybe start on a path towards like socializing the concepts and thinking about how to move forward. Within the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, we are working on a leadership development course that will be a bolt-on to this thing called the University Academy, which is kind of a reboot of Gold College. But this bolt-on FOMD leadership is going to focus on EDI concepts, on psychological safety, and some real practical things as to how to navigate our administrative environment as they relate to those things. That's coming in January 2024. That will be something that's will be directed towards divisional directors, chairs, and eventually to building a pipeline of junior leaders. So that's going to be a very exciting thing. And of course, for those of you who are participating in Kurt Johnson's AHS Critical Conversations course, you'll realize just how valuable that's been over the last few months. And Kurt tells me that there are other offerings in the pipeline for 2024. So with that, I want to just remind ourselves that we've got a working definition of psychological safety, interpersonal risk-taking, a climate that's pervasive. We've got a better understanding as to why it's important, and that we've considered how psychological safety manifests itself in our working environment. And with that, I want to draw today's rounds to a close. I want to thank you for your attention. I've left you with my email address. A talk like this oftentimes spurs a certain response in people, and I'll be delighted to hear from you. I haven't unfortunately got too much time for questions. If we've got any, I'm happy to field those. I'm happy to stick around for the next half hour or so. And I'm happy to have you contact me as well. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And there's tons to consider and a real call to action. As you say, we've nearly done it in terms of time for this morning. I hope that people who are interested get in touch with Rob directly via his emails. Just one comment online about the CPSA, who has issues with staff feeling that IMG should be grateful to be allowed to work in Alberta. someone who's been directly told by staff, it's a privilege to work in Canada. And so I shouldn't question any of the hoops I have to jump through, even though some of them are completely arbitrary. I know that's been a problem around recruitment, and people have considered that and been in touch with the CPSA. I mean, but again, tons of here to go through. I think you should come back personally, and there should be more of this. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody online for being here to listen, and see you next week. Thank you.